The year was 1941, and the British Isles were under a siege of shadows. While the big wing of the RAF fought the legendary dogfights of the Battle of Britain, a different kind of threat was slipping through the cracks. German reconnaissance planes, specifically the high-altitude Junkers Ju-86P and the nimble Arado AR-196, were ghosting over the English coastline. They weren't there to drop bombs. They were there to photograph radar installations, troop movements, and the very airfields the RAF relied on. They were the eyes of the Luftwaffe, and they were infuriatingly difficult to catch. The problem was stealth and altitude. By the time a Spitfire could scramble, warm its Merlin engine, and climb to intercept, the German scout had already clicked its shutter and banked back toward occupied France. The British military needed a solution that was silent, required no runway, and could strike with the speed of a lightning bolt. Enter the Interception Research Bureau, a clandestine wing of the British Air Ministry. Amidst the folders of experimental rockets and radar jamming chaff, one proposal stood out for its sheer, medieval audacity: Project Aquila. The idea didn't come from an aerospace engineer, but from a group of elite falconers and naturalists who had spent their lives studying the fastest animal on the planet. They proposed the formation of a falconry unit, not for sport, but for specialized air defense. The logic was grounded in the predatory mechanics of the Golden Eagle and the Peregrine Falcon. A Golden Eagle possesses a grip strength of over 400 psi and a stoop, a hunting dive, that can exceed 150 miles per hour. Most importantly, a bird of prey does not show up on 1940s era radar. It emits no heat signature for primitive infrared sensors. It is, quite literally, the world's first stealth interceptor. The unit was established in a secluded manner in the Scottish Highlands, far from the prying eyes of aware spies. Leading the unit was Captain Ronald Stevens, a man who spoke to birds more than he spoke to soldiers. He was given a handful of elite Golden Eagles, many of them recruited from the rugged peaks of the Cairngorms. To the regular RAF pilots, the idea of using birds to fight Messerschmitts was a joke, a desperate mad scientist scheme born of the Blitz-induced stress. They called Stevens' team the Feathered Folly. But Stevens knew something the Spitfire pilots didn't. He knew that a bird of prey doesn't see a plane as a machine, it sees it as an intruder in its territory. He knew that an eagle's eyes are equivalent to 8x magnification binoculars, capable of spotting a moving target from miles away. The goal was to harness that territorial aggression and turn it into a biological weapon. They weren't just training pets. They were weaponizing an apex predator to hunt the most advanced technology of the 20th century. As the first eagles were hooded and brought to the training grounds, the air of the Highlands was filled with a new kind of war cry, one that had been heard for millennia, but never against a Luftwaffe wing. The training of Project Aquila was a grueling exercise in behavioral engineering that looked more like a scene from an ancient myth than a modern military operation. Captain Stevens and his team of falconers faced a daunting task. How do you convince a biological entity that a 3-ton, roaring metal beast is prey? A golden eagle naturally hunts grouse, hares, or young deer. To them, a Junkers Ju-86 was a mountain, a loud, vibrating, terrifying mountain. To bridge this gap, Stevens utilized the principle of territorial conditioning. They began by constructing full-scale wooden mock-ups of German reconnaissance planes, specifically focusing on the Arado AR-196. These dummies were painted with the distinct black and white Balkenkreuz, the German cross, to ensure the birds developed a visual trigger. To entice the birds to strike, the trainers would hide fresh meat inside the engine cowlings of these mock-ups. Every time an eagle successfully dived and struck the cockpit or the engine, it was rewarded. But static targets were not enough. The birds had to learn to hit a moving target in the three-dimensional chaos of the sky. To simulate this, the team used a primitive but effective trolley system, a wire-guided dummy plane that zipped across the highland valleys at high speeds. Stevens also recruited the help of local RAF pilots who were instructed to fly their training biplanes at low speeds and low altitudes. The falconers would release the eagles from high cliffs, teaching them to use the advantage of altitude to stoop, a vertical dive that utilized gravity to turn the bird into a living projectile. The most critical part of the training was the kill zone. Stevens realized that an eagle could never actually destroy a plane, but it could disable the pilot or the delicate instrumentation. He trained the Eagles to target the most vulnerable part of the aircraft, the glass of the cockpit canopy and the air intakes of the engine. The Eagles were fitted with Talon-Guards, specialized leather boots reinforced with small, sharpened steel spikes. This wasn't just to protect the bird, it was to turn their natural grip into a piercing weapon capable of shattering plexiglass or shredding the canvas control surfaces of a reconnaissance plane. The training was dangerous. Several birds were lost to the terrifying slipstream of the planes. The violent air turbulence created by a moving propeller could snap an eagle's wing in an instant. The falconers had to teach the birds a strike and peel maneuver, hit the cockpit from a high-angle blind spot, and immediately bank away into a dive to avoid the prop wash. The birds were also desensitized to the sound of warfare. Trainers would fire flare guns and blank-loaded machine guns while the birds were feeding, ensuring that the thunder of a dogfight wouldn't send them into a panicked retreat. By the end of 6 months, the unit had 4 Alpha Eagles: Hera, Thor, Ares, and Vulcan. These birds no longer saw a German plane as an object, they saw it as a rival predator encroaching on their nest. Vulcan, the largest of the group, was particularly aggressive. During a test run, he struck a dummy cockpit with such force that his steel-shod talons punched through the wooden frame. Captain Stevens watched through his binoculars, realizing that while the RAF had the Spitfire, he had something more primal, an interceptor that could think for itself and felt no fear. The first real-world test of Project Aquila occurred on a misty Tuesday in late 1941, off the craggy cliffs of the Isle of Wight. A lone Arado AR-196, a twin-float reconnaissance seaplane, was loitering at 2,000 feet. The German pilot, Lieutenant Hans Weber, felt relatively secure. He was below the British radar floor, hugging the coastline to photograph the new, chain-home radar towers. To Weber, the sky was empty, save for the occasional seagull and the distant rhythmic hum of his own BMW radial engine. On a hidden outcrop below, Captain Stevens held Vulcan. The Golden Eagle was hooded, its chest heaving with a calm, predatory rhythm. Stevens was linked by field telephone to a coastal observer who had spotted the Arado through high-powered binoculars. Target approaching. Bearing 190. Altitude 1,800, the voice crackled. Stevens didn't wait for a second confirmation. He whipped off Vulcan's hood. The Eagle's head snapped toward the horizon. His nictitating membranes flicked across his golden eyes, adjusting his focus instantly. He didn't see a plane, he saw a giant. Buzzing intruder violating his airspace. With a powerful shove from Stevens' leather-clad arm, Vulcan took flight. He didn't fly toward the plane, he flew upward, spiraling into the gray overcast to gain the ultimate tactical advantage, the sun at his back and gravity on his side. Inside the Arado, Weber was adjusting his camera settings. He never saw the bird. Vulcan reached 3,000 feet, folded his wings into a tight, aerodynamic V, and began his stoop. In seconds, the Eagle was traveling at nearly 160 miles per hour. He was a brown and gold blur, silent and invisible against the clouds. Weber first noticed something was wrong when a shadow flickered across his dashboard. He glanced up, expecting to see a Spitfire diving out of the sun. Instead, he saw something that defied all his training. A massive, feathered shape was hurtling toward his cockpit. For a split second, Weber's brain refused to process the image. It was a bird, but a bird the size of a man's torso, its talons extended like landing gear, tipped with a glint of Stevens' steel reinforcements. The impact was a sickening thud crunch that echoed through the light aluminum frame of the Arado. Vulcan struck the top of the plexiglass canopy with the force of a falling sledgehammer. The steel-clad talons didn't just scratch the surface, they shattered the specialized E-glass, sending a spray of sharp fragments into the cockpit. Weber screamed, ducking his head as a wing beat like a thunderclap hammered against the glass. Vulcan wasn't finished. Following his strike and peel training, he used the momentum of the impact to kick off the cockpit, his talons raking across the engine cowling. He shredded the thin metal louvers of the air intake before banking sharply into the slipstream. Weber was in a state of total aerodynamic and psychological shock. His cockpit was whistling with the wind rushing through the shattered glass. He was bleeding from a small cut on his cheek, and his engine began to cough. A fragment of the bird's leather boot, or a piece of shattered plexiglass had been sucked into the intake. Panic-stricken and convinced he was being attacked by some secret British biological weapon or a hallucination brought on by altitude, Weber aborted the mission. He slammed the throttle forward and dived for the safety of the French coast, constantly looking over his shoulder for the ghost of the Highlands. Vulcan, meanwhile, was already gliding back toward the cliffs, looking for his reward of fresh meat, unaware that he had just won the world's first interspecies dogfight. When Lieutenant Weber's Arado AR-196 limped back to its base in occupied France, the ground crew gathered around the aircraft in stunned silence. They were used to seeing the jagged circular holes of .303 machine gun fire or the catastrophic tears of 20mm cannon shells. What they saw instead looked like the work of a prehistoric monster. The plexiglass canopy was a spiderweb of cracks, with 3 distinct, parallel punctures that had punched entirely through the reinforced glass. Deep, rhythmic gouges were carved into the soft aluminum of the engine cowling, and a strange, organic tuft of brown down feather was wedged into the oil cooler intake. The report Weber filed was met with ridicule by his superiors until they examined the gun camera footage, a brief, blurred sequence showing a massive, feathered shape blotting out the sun before the screen went dark. Back in the Highlands, Captain Stevens was conducting his own damage assessment. Vulcan had returned, but he was not unscathed. The sheer physics of striking a metal object at 160 miles per hour had taken a toll. One of the Eagle's primary talons had been snapped off at the base. The steel Talon-Guard had held, but the biological structure beneath had failed under the torque of the impact. Vulcan's left wing showed signs of prop-wash bruising, a shimmering hematoma under the feathers where the violent turbulence of the Arado's propeller had nearly swatted him out of the sky. This was the cold reality of Project Aquila. The Interceptor was made of bone and blood, while the prey was made of steel and lead. Stevens realized that, in a head-on collision between a bird and a propeller, the propeller would win 100% of the time. If the Eagle mistook the spinning blades for the head of the intruder, the bird would be instantly vaporized. The damage assessment phase revealed a terrifying cost-benefit ratio. To mission kill a single German scout plane, Stevens had nearly sacrificed his best alpha predator. He began experimenting with deterrent strikes rather than kill strikes. He modified the Talon-Guards to carry small, chemical smoke flares that would ignite upon impact. The goal shifted: don't try to destroy the plane, just blind the pilot and foul the engine enough to force a retreat. The British military analysts were divided. The eyes on the ground loved the idea. It was cheap, silent, and psychologically devastating. But the engineers pointed out the reliability gap. A Spitfire would fly whenever there was fuel and a pilot. An Eagle wouldn't fly if it was molting, if it wasn't hungry, or if the wind was blowing from the wrong quadrant. The propeller versus Talons debate became a microcosm of the war itself. Could ancient, natural instincts survive in an age of total industrial mechanization? Stevens looked at Vulcan, perched in the dim light of the Muse, his wing drooping slightly. The bird had proven it could be done, but at what cost? The Eagle had hunted the Luftwaffe and won the first round, but the Luftwaffe had thousands of planes, and Stevens only had 4 Eagles. The project was at a crossroads: expand into a full-scale, biological wing, or remain a footnote in the history of unconventional warfare. Despite the mounting physical toll on the birds, the initial success of Vulcan's strike sent a shockwave through the upper echelons of the British Air Ministry. To the generals in London, who were desperate for any edge during the dark days of 1941, Project Aquila looked like a miracle of low-cost, high-impact defense. They saw a future where every radar station along the chain home line was equipped with a muse of avian interceptors. The order came down: expand. Captain Stevens was given the resources to move beyond a mere research bureau. Project Aquila was elevated to the #1 Special Falconry Wing. Stevens was authorized to recruit 40 more Golden Eagles and Peregrine Falcons. This expansion, however, highlighted the first major flaw in the plan. You cannot mass-produce an apex predator. Unlike a factory turning out Spitfire airframes, an Eagle takes years to mature and months of one-on-one bonding with a master falconer to become a weapon. Stevens scoured the British Isles for the only men capable of handling the expansion, a motley crew of Scottish gamekeepers, eccentric aristocrats, and even a few poachers who had been released from prison specifically for their sensitive hands with birds of prey. This squadron of hunting birds was divided into 3 tactical flights. A flight, the heavy hitters, consisting of golden eagles for targeting larger reconnaissance planes. B flight, the interceptors, made of peregrine falcons trained to strike the control surfaces of smaller drones and messengers, and C flight, the harriers, used for coastal patrol. The training became more sophisticated. Stevens introduced chemical warfare on a biological level. The eagles were trained to avoid the front of the plane, the deadly fan of the propeller, by using a lure that emitted a specific, pungent scent placed only on the tail section of the mock-ups. They were also fitted with intercom hoods. These were specialized leather hoods with small, built-in radio receivers, allowing the falconers on the ground to use high-pitched sonic whistles to guide the birds toward a target they couldn't yet see. For a brief, surreal moment in 1942, the English coastline was defended by a biological, early warning system. Falcons were stationed on the white cliffs of Dover, tethered to the wrists of men in RAF blue. When the radar picked up a low-flying bogey, the falconers wouldn't wait for the scramble bell, they would cast their birds into the updrafts. The expansion also saw the development of the Falconry carrier, modified open-top trucks that could race down the beach, allowing the birds to launch with an initial burst of speed. The vision was grand, a sky filled with thousands of years of evolutionary predatory skill, redirected against the Third Reich. Stevens even began dreaming of parachute falcons, birds dropped from bombers over Germany to harass enemy airfields. But as the numbers grew, so did the ego of the eagle. Unlike machines, these birds were territorial. When Stevens tried to fly more than 2 eagles in the same sector, they often ignored the German planes entirely and began fighting each other for dominance of the sky. The squadron was becoming a chaotic, feathered riot. The romantic image of a fleet of hunting birds was beginning to clash with the messy, unpredictable reality of nature. The expansion had reached its zenith, but the cracks in the foundation were about to bring the entire project crashing back to Earth. The final nail in the coffin was reliability. The British military operates on probability of kill and serviceable rates. A Spitfire had a 90% chance of starting when the pilot turned the magnetos. A Golden Eagle, however, had a 50% chance of deciding it simply didn't feel like flying that day. If an eagle had eaten a large meal the day before, it would sit on the falconer's glove and watch a Junkers Ju-88 fly past with complete indifference. If the wind was too high, the birds stayed grounded. If the sun was too low, they lost their tactical edge. Then there was the IFF, identification friend or foe problem. While the birds were trained to strike the Bokenkreuz, in the heat of a dogfight, they couldn't distinguish between a German Arado and a British Westland Lysander. On one disastrous afternoon, a special wing Falcon struck a friendly RAF rescue floatplane, nearly causing a fatal crash. The risk of biological friendly fire became a liability the Air Ministry could no longer ignore. Furthermore, technology was evolving at a pace nature couldn't match. Engines were getting faster, propellers were getting sharper, and cockpits were being armored with thicker, bullet-resistant glass that even steel-clad Talons couldn't shatter. The speed gap had widened. German scouts were now pushing 300 miles per hour, speeds at which an Eagle stoop became a suicide mission due to the sheer force of the slipstream. In early 1943, the No. 1 Special Falconry Wing was quietly disbanded. The Eagles were demobilized and returned to the wild or to private estates. Captain Stevens was reassigned, and the files of Project Aquila were stamped top secret and buried in the depths of the National Archives. The eagle that hunted the Luftwaffe became a ghost story whispered in RAF mess halls, a myth of a time when Britain was so desperate they tried to recruit the sky itself to fight their battles.